Hammitt Brown is a woman who lives in the Twin Cities, and she has spent years doing this deep dive into lumberjacks of the upper Midwest, of the Northwoods. She ended up writing a book called Gentlemen of the Woods, Manhood, Myth, and the American Lumberjack. And I wanted to share some of my really fascinating, I thought, conversation with her. I think when I talked to you a couple of weeks ago, I said, Willa, we don't usually have authors on our news program, but there was just something about this topic and in my conversation with you afterward that just made me think we gotta talk about this, because what you do, I feel like, is just flip this whole idea of a lumberjack on its head, right?
That's what I really tried to do, because that's what made me so interested in the first place. Is I grew up spending all of my summers up north, and I thought I knew what had happened there. You know, we all have this idea, the plaid, the lumberjack, the Paul Bunyan. And as soon as I started researching it, I discovered that at the time, they were really thought of and treated and considered incredibly differently. And I thought, where does this image I have come from if it doesn't come from the reality of what happened on the ground in the past? And that's a subject that interests me across history, is where, in a lot of ways, the way we act and behave and think about things are not necessarily based on what happened in the past. They're based on what we believe happened in the past. And so I'm really interested in where those stories come from, why they get passed on, which ones take off, and places where we really have big myths in history. Why are those so powerful?
It sounds like there was a bit of a historical trail here. So you spent quite a bit of time, researching in history centers in our area. What did you find, and what did it tell you about the lumberjacks at that time from that perspective of the people who were writing about it?
Yeah, so most of what you find when you go looking, and I spent over a year researching in these 3 states, just in archives, not even dealing with that research. And what you really find is that most of the documents are going to be left by sort of middle-class people. They're the ones who are writing newspapers, and they hated the lumberjacks. Hated them. And you see that getting replicated. You see bigger signs of it. For instance, in a lot of the cities of the Midwest, they literally created neighborhoods and districts to try to keep the lumberjacks out of the rest of town. So the Gateway in Minneapolis, there was a neighborhood in Duluth that was just sort of, it's called the Cribs, and it was dedicated to these men who they saw as a total plague on society.
And so based on the experiences of those who were saying they're a problem, why was it? Because I think at that time, if you characterize what a lumberjack is or was at that time, it was seasonal work, right? So they were maybe traveling and just had a different lifestyle.
Yeah. And well, so this is the late 19th century. People get obsessed with tramps, sort of the culture of tramps and migrant workers, because they're really obsessed with the idea of the home is where morality is. A moral person, especially a moral man, has a good home life. And so then you have this whole group of people who have no home life. They're not connected to any one place. They're not connected to a family. And the real understanding at the time was men, if left unchecked, are going to be violent and destructive. And the thing that checks them are wives and children and mothers, are women and home life. And so these guys, without that, are men with no moral centers. They're just unchecked and dangerous.
So when did it take a turn? Then how did it change? And how did we come to this? When I think of lumberjack, it's Paul Bunyan. It's the brawny paper towel guy, right? How did that come about, right?
Yeah, so there, I think 2 or 3 things all sort of happen at once that cause this change. So one of them is authors and writers, especially on the coasts, become sort of obsessed with the lumberjack alongside the cowboy. And part of the way to think about this is if you think about Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s, that's an ideal man. He's well-dressed, he's slim, he's restrained. And then you get to like Teddy Roosevelt and these big guys out on horseback, and we become obsessed with that kind of mythology. So they start writing about these men as these triumphant, strong men who are out on the prairies and aren't being humbled by society and aren't being made effeminate. That's one strain of it. But I think what's way more important is actually what happens on the local level. So at the end of the timber era, sort of by 1910, 1920, there are no logs left in the Northwoods. There are clear-cut regions that go for miles and miles and miles and miles. And it devastates the economy because that was what the whole economy was based on. And local towns start trying to figure out, okay, what is our new economy? And they really land on tourism. And so they start talking a lot about the Northwoods as this natural destination. And the lumberjack becomes this sort of fun mythic folklore that can be used to promote the area. And then at the same time, the companies who had cut down all the logs are now in trouble. Some of the biggest fires in American history, the single deadliest fire in American history was on the cutover in Wisconsin, the Peshtigo fire. And they are getting a lot of flack for this. And so they start selling this image of a small scale, charming industry rather than a big extractive industrial force. They don't want to be painted with the same brush as the oil barons. They want to be charming, cutesy, folksy. So Paul Bunyan himself was invented to advertise Red River lumber as we know him. He was a cartoon as an ad.
So what's the truth? If we have this extreme over here, and then we have this extreme over here, Willa, what should we be thinking about lumberjacks?
Who are these guys? I think the answer is it's somewhere in between. And this is what's really fun about history is you can never actually know what happened in the past by its nature. All you can do is read and read and read until you're pretty sure you're right. And especially with men like the lumberjacks who were mostly illiterate and didn't leave a lot of documents, you have to do a lot of reading between the lines, looking at photographs, I did a lot of work listening to old lumberjack ballads and tall tales from the camps to try to get a sense of who they were. And I think the answer is it's somewhere in between the two. They did embrace violence as part of their life. Fighting was a big part in the summer, and in camps they weren't allowed to fight, but in towns they did fight. But they embraced violence and that kind of thing because strength and skill were so important for surviving in the woods. And they did have a set of morals, and they did have a way they conducted themselves. And it wasn't totally lawless. It's just that that's how it looked from the outside, and it's outsiders who were writing it down.
Here in Minnesota, what sort of, I guess, is there a physical legacy that the lumberjacks have left from that era, other than the Paul Bunyan, Babe the Blue Ox that we all know
about? Pauls and babes all over the place. Yeah. So in some ways, there are two legacies you can see. One is, I just have to plug whenever I can, the Minnesota Historical Society's Forest History Center in Grand Rapids. It's amazing. It's a recreation of a 1900 camp. The other legacy is tiny, which is there is up about an hour north of Grand Rapids, something called the Lost 40. And that is the only 40 acres in the entire state that was not timbered. Of the white pine was not removed from. It was left untouched because a surveyor made an error and said that there was a lake there. And so nobody could buy it to timber it. And so it was left untouched. And you can go and visit and you can see, we think of the Northwoods now. We tend to go up north and be like, look at this pristine, beautiful, untouched nature. It's not untouched. It's all second growth. It's all less than 100 years old. But if you go to the Lost 40, you'll see trees that are, 3 or 4 feet across the trunk that are 120, 130, 140 feet high, which is what Minnesota looked like before white settlers came and before we started timbering.
All right, that is Willa Hammitt Brown. The book is Gentlemen of the woods, the sort of true story of the lumberjack. And I said, so which is it? Like over here, over here? She said, somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, she's got to be a little bit diplomatic. That was fascinating. I could listen to her talk for 20 more minutes.
I know, and you know about this Lost 40.
Yes,
You've
it
heard
is.
of it?
Well, and I've done just from other assignments, dug really deep into Paul Bunyan lore, and it's fascinating. Yeah, when you can see it from like a satellite map. When you zoom in on Minnesota, it looks different than everything around it.
Oh my goodness.
Very crazy.
Maybe somebody can go do that. Put that on the list of things to do this summer or this weekend, because you've got...
I'll take the selfie stick up to the Lost 40.
Would we get a signal there? I don't know.
Well, yeah, that's up in the air. A lot going on this weekend. Starting up in northern Minnesota, the John Bear Grease Sled Dog Race. This is the 40th year of